The war that Washington said was already won just put 15 American service members in a hospital bed. Let that settle in for a moment. While the President of the United States stood in the Oval Office and told the American people, told the world, that this thing is finished, that Tehran has been broken, that the planes are flying over Iran's capital without a single shot fired back at them. Iran launched 6 ballistic missiles and 29 drones directly at Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, and those weapons found their mark. Americans got hurt. Refueling aircraft got torn apart. And over 300 American service members have now been wounded since this conflict began on the 28th of February. 7 are dead. 7 Americans who woke up one morning not knowing it would be their last. This is what winning looks like in the 21st century, and the American people deserve to understand exactly what is happening. Not the version being packaged and sold to them every evening on cable news, but the real picture, the strategic picture, the picture that history will eventually be forced to tell whether anyone wants it to or not. Now let's slow down and think carefully, because this situation is far more complex than any headline can capture, and the American people are being given fragments when they need the full mosaic. Trump stood in the Oval Office and said, "We've literally got planes flying over Tehran and other parts of their country. They can't do a thing about it." And in one narrow technical sense, he's not wrong. American air power is dominant. It has always been dominant. Nobody disputes that. But dominance in the air and victory in a conflict are 2 entirely different things, and conflating them is a mistake that this country has made before in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and apparently we are not done making it. The Trump administration's talking points on the Iran war have been a moving target, with officials giving sometimes conflicting takes on the operation's goals in language that evolves in real time. One day the war is won. The next day there are still 3,554 targets left to strike. One day the operation could end soon. The next day the military may need to go further. This is not strategic communication. This is improvisation. And improvisation in warfare at this scale with these stakes is genuinely dangerous, not just for the men and women wearing the uniform, but for the entire global economic order that the United States helped construct and has depended upon for 80 years. Iran fired 6 ballistic missiles and 29 drones at Saudi Arabia's Prince Sultan Air Base in an attack that injured at least 15 troops, including 5 seriously. Now think about what that means geographically and strategically. Iran just reached across international borders and struck a sovereign Saudi military installation where American forces are stationed. That is not the behavior of a broken adversary. That is not the behavior of a country that has been militarily obliterated. That is the behavior of a regime that has been battered, yes, brutally, devastatingly battered, but that still retains enough capability, enough will, and enough organizational coherence to reach out and draw American blood in the middle of what the President of the United States called a finished war. And here is where I want you to think very carefully, because the strategic implications of what is happening in that region right now extend far beyond any single military engagement. The war has upended global air travel, disrupted oil exports, caused fuel prices to soar, and Iran's stranglehold on the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway that handles roughly 1/5 of the world's oil, has exacerbated the economic fallout. 1/5 of the world's oil. Think about what that means for every American family that drives to work, that heats their home, that buys groceries that had to be shipped across the country on trucks running on diesel. This is not an abstraction. This is the kitchen table. This is the wallet. This is the monthly budget of millions of ordinary Americans who were never asked whether they wanted this conflict and who are now paying for it every time they pull up to the pump. Trump has demanded that Iran fully reopen the critical waterway and has extended his deadline to April 6th, as negotiations are described as ongoing. But let's be honest about what we're watching here. We are watching a president who launched what he called major combat operations without going to Congress, without building a public case, without a defined end state, and who is now in the uncomfortable position of having declared victory while the enemy is still shooting, still hitting targets, still wounding American personnel, that is a credibility problem. And credibility in geopolitics is everything. Once you lose it with allies, with adversaries, with your own people, it is extraordinarily difficult to recover. U.S. Central Command confirmed that more than 300 service members have been wounded in this conflict. Most have returned to duty, while 30 remained out of action and 10 are considered seriously wounded. The American public should know these numbers. They should be on the front page of every newspaper. They should be leading every broadcast. Instead, they're buried inside live update pages that most people will never scroll far enough to find. There is something deeply wrong with a media environment and a political environment that allows a president to declare a war won while hundreds of Americans are being carried off the battlefield. Now, I want to talk about Saudi Arabia for a moment because its role in this conflict is being almost completely ignored in the mainstream conversation, and it is absolutely essential to understanding where this is headed. Trump said it will be time for Saudi Arabia and Israel to normalize ties after the war in Iran wraps up. So we have an American president who just watched Iran strike a Saudi military base, a base where American troops were stationed, a base where American refueling aircraft were destroyed, and his response is to talk about the Abraham Accords, the normalization deal, the diplomatic prize that has been dangled for years. And I understand the strategic logic. A Saudi-Israeli normalization, if it ever actually happens, would be a genuinely significant realignment of the Middle East. But using American military power to create the conditions for that deal, using the blood of American service members as a down payment on a diplomatic agreement, is a transaction that deserves far more scrutiny than it is receiving. A Navy ship carrying about 2,500 Marines has now arrived in the region. The USS Tripoli, an amphibious assault ship, along with elements from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, brings transport and strike fighter aircraft as well as amphibious assault assets. Amphibious assault assets. Let's think about what that means. Amphibious assault means the capability to put troops on a beach, on a shore, to seize territory from the sea. The most obvious target that comes to mind, and military analysts have been discussing this openly, is Karg Island, where Iran's largest oil depot stands. The U.S. in the last week has sent additional troops to the region that could be used in some kind of ground operation, particularly on Karg Island. But doing so could greatly raise U.S. casualties and political pain for the administration. Steve Bannon, speaking at CPAC, has already warned the American public that their sons and daughters could end up on Karg Island. That is not a fringe warning. That is a serious strategic signal that the escalation ladder has more rungs left on it. And yet, the president continues to negotiate. Trump posted on Truth Social that the United States and Iran have had very good and productive conversations regarding a complete and total resolution of hostilities and announced a 5-day pause on strikes against Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure. Iran, for its part, has officially denied that direct negotiations are taking place. Iran's foreign ministry spokesman said that messages had been received from friendly countries regarding the U.S.'s request for negotiations, but Tehran's position on the Strait of Hormuz and conditions for ending the war have not changed. So we have two countries, one of which has been bombing the other for nearly a month, publicly disagreeing about whether they are even talking to each other. Pakistan is apparently acting as an intermediary. Jared Kushner is described as a volunteer negotiator. Steve Witkoff is floating a 15-point peace proposal. And American service members are in hospitals in Saudi Arabia. This is the reality beneath the headlines. This is what the flag waving and the victory declarations are covering over. And the American people who are funding this conflict with their tax dollars, who are sending their sons and daughters to serve in this region, who are paying for it every time they fill up their gas tank or buy a bag of fertilizer, deserve to see it clearly. Trump said he won't use the word war because of concerns that using that word triggers constitutional requirements for congressional authorization. He said, and these are essentially his words, that he'll call it a military operation instead. Think about that for a moment. The President of the United States is deliberately choosing terminology to avoid the constitutional requirement that the Congress of the United States authorize the use of force. The men and women being shot at, the ones in the hospital right now with shrapnel wounds, they don't get to decide whether it's a war or a military operation. Their bodies don't know the difference. Their families don't know the difference. The only difference is legal and political, and it matters enormously for the long-term health of American democracy that the people's representatives have a say in whether this country goes to war. Pakistan has been working to facilitate negotiations between Iran and the U.S., with the U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff described as having a direct connection to Pakistan's army chief, General Asim Munir. So the diplomatic architecture being assembled here involves Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, apparently Oman in the background, and a constellation of Gulf states all trying to create conditions for some kind of off-ramp. The Iranian ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva said Tehran has agreed to facilitate and expedite humanitarian aid through the Strait of Hormuz, even as it endures strikes on its nuclear facilities. That is a small but potentially meaningful concession. It suggests that someone on the Iranian side is making rational calculations about survival, about the country's future, about what kind of deal might be possible, and rational calculations even from adversaries, even from regimes we find deeply objectionable, are what diplomacy is made of. More than 1,200 people have been killed in Iran, 570 in Lebanon, and 12 people in Israel, according to figures from Iranian and Lebanese health officials and Israeli authorities. Those numbers will grow. They always do. The architecture of modern warfare, precision strikes, air power dominance, standoff munitions, creates the illusion that wars can be clean, fast, and low cost. They cannot. They never have been. Every war has a price, and the price is always paid in human life, in national treasure, and in the long-term credibility and moral standing of the nation that wages it. The question that every serious American should be asking right now is not whether our planes are flying over Tehran. They are. The question is not whether we have more military power than Iran. We do, and by an enormous margin. The question is what comes after. What replaces the regime that is being systematically decapitated? The new supreme leader of Iran, Mojtaba Khamenei, is the son of the supreme leader killed in the first day of U.S. and Israeli strikes, and he has not been seen in public since Iran said he had become supreme leader. So Iran has a new supreme leader who nobody has seen, leading a government that is simultaneously being bombed and negotiating, or not negotiating, depending on who you ask, under extraordinary pressure. U.S. debt is drawing weaker demand as $10 trillion must be rolled over this year amid the Iran war, with analysts noting that the bond market remains undefeated. $10 trillion in debt rollover, fuel prices soaring, global fertilizer shortages, air travel disrupted. These are the cascading economic consequences of a conflict that the American public was not prepared for, that Congress did not authorize, and that the administration is still struggling to define in terms of its goals, its timeline, and its endpoint. The American people are resilient. They have always been resilient. But resilience is not the same as informed consent, and right now they are being asked to accept the costs of this conflict, economic, human, strategic, without being given the full picture of what those costs are, what the goals are, and what victory actually means. 15 Americans wounded in Saudi Arabia while the president declares the war won. That is the sentence that history will remember. The only question is what sentence comes next.